January 1945. The snow lies heavy on the roads of northern Europe, a hard, gray crust crushed beneath the treads of tanks. The war is in its final, brutal months across the frozen countryside. German crews wait in silence inside their Panthers, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. They've fought Shermans before, hundreds of them. Slow, tall silhouettes that burned easily under the bite of an 88mm gun. But this time, something is different. From the mist, they hear engines, faster, higher-pitched, smooth American tanks, yet moving with an agility the Germans don't recognize. Tracks glide across frozen mud where others would sink. Turrets swing effortlessly. And when the first shells crack out, the Germans realize they're facing a new breed, the M4A3E8 Sherman, the Easy 8. For the first time in the war, German tankers would admit they'd never seen speed like it. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had changed its rhythm. What began as a lightning conquest by Germany had turned into a grinding struggle of endurance. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. And now, the Allied armies pushed relentlessly toward the Rhine. But the path into Germany was not open ground. It was an iron maze. Every hill, every forest, every river crossing concealed a German gun. And among those guns, the most feared were not always the artillery pieces, but the tanks. The German armored corps, once the pride of Blitzkrieg, was battered, yet still deadly. The Panther, sleek and lethal, remained a formidable opponent. The WWII and Tiger II, heavy beasts of steel, were capable of destroying any Allied tank long before the enemy could reply. To the men of the U.S. Army, the sight of a tiger's silhouette on the horizon still carried the weight of dread. The American mainstay, the M4 Sherman, had won battles through numbers and reliability, not superiority. Its 75mm gun was effective against infantry and light vehicles, but against German armor, it often wasn't enough. Crews learned to flank, to strike from the side, to move fast and pray their first hit counted. They called it death by chance, and many young gunners never saw a second engagement. By mid-1944, the American ordnance officers knew the Sherman needed evolution, not a complete redesign. The U.S. could not pause production, but an upgrade that would keep their tankers alive and competitive. Thus began the transformation that would lead to the M4A3E8, a new engine, a reworked suspension, and most importantly, a gun with reach. Underneath its armor, engineers replaced the vertical volute suspension with a new horizontal volute spring system, HVSS. It gave the tank a smoother ride, better traction, and allowed the use of wider 23-inch tracks. The men who drove it said it felt like gliding compared to the old, jarring Shermans. The design team also implemented wet ammunition stowage, surrounding shells with a protective glycol mixture that drastically reduced the risk of fire after penetration. And atop the turret, the old 75mm cannon was replaced with the long-barreled 76mm M1 gun that it could finally punch through the side armor of a Panther at typical combat ranges. Not a perfect solution, but it gave American crews a fighting chance, while engineers were perfecting the Easy 8 in Detroit and Cleveland. The German front was collapsing piece by piece. Fuel shortages grounded entire tank divisions. Training. Schools were empty. Veteran crewmen were irreplaceable. Yet, the German army continued to fight with grim efficiency, digging in behind rivers and towns, turning every retreat into another ambush. By late 1944, the U.S. Army began shipping the first production batches of M4A3E8s across the Atlantic. They reached Europe just in Time for the bitter winter offensive. The Battle of the Yonne. Fresh American crews were introduced to their new machines in the snow-covered fields of Belgium. Some didn't, yet grasp what they had. Others quickly understood. This tank could move differently. It could traverse uneven ground, pivot faster, and accelerate out of danger where the older Shermans would bog down. German tankers, used to gauging American armor by its clumsy mobility, soon faced something new, a tank that was hard to predict, fast to relocate, and nearly impossible to corner. The race between firepower and speed had entered its final chapter. And as Allied tank battalions rolled east, they carried not only superior numbers, but a new kind of momentum, mechanical, relentless, and unmistakably American. The battlefield was changing, and the German tank crews would soon witness that change firsthand. Across the Atlantic, Liberty ships carried more than just supplies. They carried evolution. Rows of olive-drab hulls, chained and secured. The M4A3E8 Shermans arrived in Europe during the closing months of 1944. They rolled off the docks of Antwerp and Cherbourg under sleet and artillery haze, their steel still smelling of factory paint. Each tank represented lessons learned through fire. Behind its refined engineering was the blood of thousands of crews lost in North Africa, Normandy, and the hedgerows of France. The American war machine had listened and adapted. Crews assigned to the new Shermans quickly noticed the difference. The tank felt lighter on its treads, smoother on rough ground. It could reach nearly 30 miles per hour on open terrain, astonishing speed for its class. When veteran drivers first throttled up, they described it as a horse breaking free. And for the first time, they could fight on equal terms with German armor, not just overwhelm it with numbers. The U.S. 4th Armored Division and 3rd Armored Division were among the first to receive the EZ-8. In the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, where snow, fog, and forest choked visibility, this tank's improved suspension and powertrain became its most valuable weapon. While older Shermans struggled to climb frozen slopes, the EZ-8 moved with an almost unnatural grace. It could fire on the move, reposition in seconds, and exploit terrain that immobilized its predecessors. To the Germans, who relied on the superior firepower of their Panthers and Tigers, speed had never been a true concern. Their armor was built for killing power and frontal dominance, not agility. But as the Allies advanced through the villages of Belgium and Luxembourg, German tankers began to report unusual encounters. Shermans, faster, lower, more responsive, were flanking them in record time. At first, they believed these were British Fireflies or even experimental American prototypes, but reconnaissance soon confirmed the truth. New American variant had entered the field. Captured examples of the M4A3E8 were taken to German depots for inspection. Engineers noted the redesigned suspension, the wider tracks, and the smoother ride. In reports, they described it as an improved Sherman with high maneuvering capability. One assessment, found later in captured Wehrmacht documents, commented simply, "It moves faster than we can aim." This admission, quiet and clinical, reflected a larger reality. Germany's industrial heart was collapsing. While the Americans were refining and upgrading their tanks on an assembly line that never slept, German production was crumbling under bombing raids. By late 1944, factories in Kassel, Nuremberg, and Vienna were barely operating. Steel was scarce, engines unreliable, and replacements arrived slower than the front collapsed. And yet, the Wehrmacht's tank crews remained professional, disciplined, and deadly. They adapted tactics: ambush from forests, attack from ridgelines, retreat, and strike again. But now, Allied armor could respond faster than ever before. The EZ-8 wasn't just a better tank, It was a mechanical advantage that eroded the last remaining strength of the German panzer divisions. Initiative. As American armor pushed through the Ardennes, Easy 8s began to dominate skirmishes. They could accelerate, turn, and outmaneuver Panthers before the German gunners could traverse their turrets. Even when outgunned, their speed allowed them to reposition and flank within moments. In engagements near Bastogne and Houffalize, several Panther crews were reportedly destroyed by tanks they never saw approach. In the frozen forests, where the air echoed with diesel engines and the smell of cordite, German commanders realized that their edge was slipping away, not by firepower, but by momentum. The battlefield had become a race, and the Easy 8 was winning it. Soon, the snow would melt, the roads would clear, and the Allies, now armed with a tank that could run as well as it could fight, would turn that speed toward Germany itself. As winter faded, the stage was set for the final armored clashes of the war, where German crews would face the M4A3E8 head-on, and for the first time, find themselves chasing an enemy they could no longer outgun. Every tank was a machine, but every crew was human. To understand what happened when German tankers met the M4A3E8, we have to look at the men behind the armor and the thoughts that drove them. Inside a Sherman, space was a luxury. 4 men crammed around a roaring engine, their voices drowned beneath the rumble of treads. For months they had fought with fear in their throats, knowing that one Panther shell could turn their world into a furnace. But when they climbed into the Easy 8, something changed. Drivers spoke of a living machine, one that responded instantly, turning with a smoothness they had never felt before. Gunners, finally armed with the long 76mm, whispered that at last they could answer the Germans shot for shot. It wasn't just hardware. It was confidence, the rarest armor of all. Across the line, German crews faced a different emotion: fatigue. By early 1945, many Panzer crews were veterans of Kursk, Normandy, or the Eastern Front. They had seen comrades lost to airstrikes, fuel shortages, endless retreats. When reports came in of faster American tanks, some dismissed them as rumors. Others, especially the young replacements, watched the horizon with unease. They had been taught that Shermans were easy prey. Now that certainty was gone. The human battle began long before the first shot. On paper, the Easy 8 was still a medium tank, never meant to duel Tigers head-on, but its design reshaped tactics across the Western. Front commanders learned to use speed like a weapon. The horizontal volant suspension system, HVSS, allowed a stable gun platform even at high speed. Crews could fire while moving, a concept the Germans rarely practiced. In the dense villages of Belgium or the broken fields of the Ruhr, American platoons began employing shoot-and-scoot tactics. One tank would fire to draw the enemy's attention, while another flanked wide, using the Easy 8's mobility to strike from the side. German doctrine, built around defensive firepower, struggled to keep pace. Their heavier armor meant slower acceleration and more predictable movement. Each time a Panther traversed its massive gun, the Easy 8 was already shifting position, forcing German gunners to realign again and again. The battlefield rhythm had reversed. The once hunters had become the hunted. Beneath its armor, the M4A3E8 represented America's philosophy of war: standardization and speed of innovation. Instead of reinventing the tank, engineers refined it. The new Ford GAA V8 engine gave the Easy 8 a burst of raw horsepower, 500 at 2,600 RPM. Paired with the HVSS and wider tracks, it offered both velocity and control on muddy ground, where older Shermans spun helplessly. The 76mm M1 gun, firing high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, finally gave crews a tool to challenge the Panther's side armor at 800 to 1,000 meters. Not perfection, but parity. American. Factories produced these improvements at breathtaking speed. In just months, the refinements were welded, painted, and shipped to Europe. It was industrial warfare at its purest, the power to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. For German engineers examining captured EZ-8s, the verdict was unsettling. It wasn't the gun that frightened them. It was the efficiency. A tank that was easier to repair, cheaper to build, and yet capable of outmaneuvering their best designs. Germany's complex engineering brilliance had met America's industrial pragmatism, and pragmatism was winning. Leadership in 1945 meant endurance. Generals on both sides were fighting exhaustion as much as the enemy. For the Americans, the EZ-8 arrived as a morale weapon. Commanders could finally tell their crews, "You're not outmatched anymore." That message alone fueled aggression. Officers began planning bolder thrusts, deep armored penetrations that used mobility to break encirclements, and spearhead advances toward the Rhine. When the 6th Faru Armored Division used EZ-8s to outflank entrenched German positions near the Saar River, the success echoed up the chain of command. The tank was not merely a vehicle, it was momentum given form. For the Germans, every engagement drained morale further. Reports reached Berlin describing enemy tanks moving faster than predicted. Commanders demanded counter-tactics that no longer existed. Fuel rations limited maneuvers, forcing crews to conserve motion, the very element that now defined Allied advantage. Even when German gunners destroyed an EZ-8, another appeared within hours. For every Tiger knocked out, 10 Shermans filled the gap. The psychological shift was irreversible. Confidence had changed sides, and on the battlefield, confidence kills as effectively as armor-piercing rounds. The stage was now set for confrontation, not in theory, but in combat. The EZ-8 would soon meet its reputation head-on. In the villages and forests of Germany itself, there, German tank crews would witness what they had once dismissed as impossible. Speed. As a weapon, wars are fought with steel, but understood with paper. After every battle, behind the front lines, German engineers and officers gathered reports. Each encounter with a new Allied weapon was dissected, measured, sketched, analyzed. When the first M4A3E8 Shermans were captured in late 1944, the findings drew quiet attention within the Wehrmacht's Panzer divisions. The German army had studied the Sherman for years. They knew its weaknesses. Tall profile, thin armor, narrow tracks. They had even used captured Shermans on the Eastern Front, painted in dark yellow with Balkenkreuz crosses, to deceive Soviet troops. But when their mechanics examined the EZ-8, the tone changed. Reports from units near Trier and Saarlautern described a noticeably improved suspension and engine, and an American medium tank with unusually good maneuverability. Field manuals recorded its wider tracks and smoother motion over rough ground, noting that it crosses mud and snow better than previous models. It wasn't fear that spread through these reports. It was respect. The same officers, who had once dismissed American tanks as inferior, now admitted the truth. This version of the Sherman could match the pace of their own blitzkrieg machines. In one German after-action statement recovered by Allied intelligence, a Panther commander from the 2nd Panzer Division described a skirmish near Cologne. The American tanks moved swiftly between cover. Their firing positions changed so quickly we could not predict the next point of contact. They appeared to slide across ground where our heavier vehicles bogged down. Another document, a late-war technical digest written by the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Ordnance Office, noted that the enemy's new model, Sherman, emphasizes speed and suspension stability, a dangerous evolution in mobile warfare. The truth was dawning. Germany had perfected the science of destruction. America had mastered the art of adaptation. Every new EZ-8 rolling off the assembly line in the United States represented a lesson learned in blood. A conversation between engineers and frontline soldiers translated into steel within weeks. In contrast, German innovations were now trapped behind bombed factories and crippled supply lines. The psychological effect of that realization was profound. German crews began to sense that the war of machines was slipping from their grasp, not because their tanks were weaker, but because their enemy could change faster than they could counter. At its core, the battle between the German Panzers and the American Shermans was not just mechanical, it was philosophical. It represented two ways of thinking about war. Germany built masterpieces. Each Panther or Tiger was a marvel of precision, meticulously engineered, complex, and expensive, but that perfection carried a price. A Tiger tank required more than 300,000 labor hours to produce. Each demanded parts that only a few factories could supply, and mechanics trained for months to maintain. When one broke down, as many did, it could be lost to logistics rather than battle. The United States built solutions. A Sherman could be repaired in a field workshop. Parts were interchangeable. A damaged track, a broken wheel, a burned-out engine, all could be replaced within hours. Factories worked in shifts around the clock. While German divisions waited weeks for replacement tanks, American units received them overnight. The M4A3E8 was the final evolution of that philosophy. Proof that wartime innovation was not about perfection, but momentum. Every bolt tightened in Detroit echoed across the Rhine. Every tank shipped meant another chance for a crew to live, another push eastward. In this sense, the EZ-8 was not just a tank. It was the manifestation of Allied industrial willpower. Where Germany's armor was art, America's was strategy. But speed carried its own moral weight. Every improvement meant that battles grew faster, deadlier, and less predictable. Tanks that once moved in cautious columns now raced through towns in chaos. Infantry struggled to keep up. Civilians, trapped in villages between advancing and retreating forces, found themselves in the crossfire of armored momentum. War was becoming not only mechanical, but kinetic. The EZ-8 symbolized the point where technology outpaced human reaction. Tank crews on both sides described moments where decisions blurred into instinct, split-second, choices between survival and destruction. In interviews after the war, some German veterans spoke of their shock at the EZ-8's movement. It was like fighting smoke, one remembered. We would aim, and it was gone. Others admitted grudging admiration. The Americans learned quickly. They built what they needed, not what they dreamed. For the U.S. Army, the lesson was clear. Speed, not armor, would define the wars of the future. The EZ-8 became a blueprint. Its balance of agility and reliability echoed in designs that followed, from Korea to the Cold War. But in 1945, none of that foresight mattered. For the German tank crews standing amid the ruins of their once invincible divisions, the EZ-8 was a reminder that even the most fearsome machine can be outpaced, not by strength, but by evolution itself. The clash between speed and firepower was now set to reach its breaking point, and it would happen not in a factory or a briefing room, but in the smoke and chaos of a final confrontation where the EZ-8 would prove, beyond question, that velocity could destroy even fear itself. March 1945. The war in Europe is burning toward its end. But no one on the front line knows that yet. Across the Rhineland, towns lie in ashes. The ground is soaked, torn apart by weeks of shell fire. This is the heart of Germany, and the final battleground for the American armored divisions. In the valley near the town of Remagen, the 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, pushes forward. Their orders: seize the bridge, hold the line, and crush any remaining German resistance. But as they move through the smoke, scouts radio a chilling report. Panthers ahead. Several dug in by the ridge. The Easy 8 crews know what that means. The Panther. Sleek, deadly, with a gun that can punch through a Sherman from over a mile away. Every American tanker has heard the same grim statistic. For every Tiger or Panther destroyed, several Shermans are lost. Inside one of those M4A3E8s sits Sergeant William Hart, 23 years old, commander of Thunderbolt 7th. He's been through France, Belgium, and now Germany. And his tank is the latest model, with the improved HVSS suspension and the new 76-meter gun. The crew trusts it like a living thing. They call it Lucky 8. The Panthers open fire. First, 2 fiery streaks scream across the field. Explosions tear up the ground around the Easy 8s. Mud rains down inside the open hatches. The American tanks fan out, engines howling. The suspension, that new horizontal system, glides over the uneven terrain where earlier Shermans would have jolted and bounced. Now they stay stable, guns steady, sights locked. Hart's gunner, Private Lewis, spots movement through his scope. Panther, 11 o'clock, hull down behind the barn. Hart, AP round, steady, fire. The 76mm shell cuts across the smoke, slams into the Panther's side armor with a deafening crack. The German tank jerks, stops, smoke pouring from its rear deck. The radio bursts alive. Good hit. Panther's burning. Keep moving. But there are more. 2 Panthers on the ridge rotate their turrets, firing in synchronized rhythm. Another Easy 8 is hit, its track blown off. The crew scrambling out under fire. Hart yells, "Driver! Flank left! Now! Don't stop! Keep the gun front!" The Easy 8 surges forward through the mud, bouncing shell fragments off its hull. Thanks to its powerful Ford GAA V8 engine, it pushes through debris, dodging a direct hit by meters. The German crews struggle to re-aim. Their Panthers are heavier, slower to traverse. From 500 yards, Lewis fires again, this time hitting the side skirt of another Panther. Sparks, smoke, then flame. The German tank crew bails out within minutes. The field turns into chaos, smoke, mud, and the shriek of engines. The Easy 8s move in a pattern the Germans didn't expect. Fast, coordinated, constantly shifting, each tank covers the other, firing and moving in perfect rhythm. This wasn't luck. It was doctrine. Mobility warfare, American style, the Easy 8's new suspension made it possible. The wider tracks kept traction even on soaked ground, while its stabilizer allowed accurate shots on the move, something the Germans had never mastered. Radio intercepts later confirmed that German commanders were confused, believing they were under attack by a much larger force. By noon, the ridge at Remagen was taken, 5 Panthers destroyed, 3 more abandoned. The Easy 8s rolled past, battered but alive. Sergeant Hart's crew was silent, hands trembling, uniforms soaked with sweat and rain. No cheers, only exhaustion and relief. That day, the 3rd Armored proved something that would echo through military history. A tank's value is not measured by its armor thickness or gun length, but by how quickly it can adapt, react, and move under fire. The M4A3E8, had done what its predecessors could not. It had outmaneuvered the predators of the WW2 battlefield. After-action reports described the engagement as an example of superior mobility defeating superior firepower. For the first time, Allied tankers no longer felt outclassed. They had faced the best of German engineering and survived. For the German crews, it was the beginning of the end, not because their machines had failed, but because time itself was no longer on their side. In war, even legends grow old, and on that cold March morning, as the Easy Eights rolled through the Rhineland, the age of the German Panther was ending, and a new chapter in armored warfare was being written by speed. By April 1945, the tide of war had become unstoppable. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. German divisions, once proud and mechanized, were now fighting in fragments. Fuel was gone, ammunition scarce, and in the chaos, one machine kept moving forward. The M4A3E8, columns of Easy Eights, rolled through broken towns, places that once belonged to the Reich, now reduced to dust and echoes. Their crews slept beside their tanks, ate cold rations, and pushed on day after day. Reports from the field described them as unrelenting. The new suspension allowed long-distance marches without breakdowns. The Ford engine, simple, dependable, needed minimal maintenance. Every hour, they closed the distance to Berlin. In contrast, German tank units were collapsing under their own weight. The Panthers and Tigers, mechanical giants of a dying army, began to falter. Without fuel or spare parts, many were abandoned. Hulks left smoldering at crossroads, sabotaged by their own crews to prevent capture. The battlefield was transforming. Where once Germany's armor dictated the fight, now mobility dictated survival. The Americans no longer chased the enemy. They overtook them. Captured German tank commanders spoke with surprising candor in post-war debriefs. One, a Panther commander from the 116th Panzer Division, described his first encounter with the Easy 8 near Cologne. "They moved so fast, I thought they were armored cars. But they fired like Shermans. Our guns could destroy them. Yes, but we could not catch them," another German officer admitted. The new Shermans did not fear the mud. They crossed terrain our Panthers could not. Their movement. It was like cavalry. To hear that from veterans of the armored elite, men who once rolled across Europe behind the EIA, unstoppable tigers and panthers, was extraordinary. Was not praise, it was realization that the battlefield had shifted under their tracks. The Easy 8 was not the most powerful tank, but it was the right tank for the moment, reliable, efficient, mobile, and fast. As the Allies surged into the heart of Germany, the M4A3E8 spearheaded assaults on towns like Kassel, Magdeburg, and Leipzig. They were the first to reach river crossings, the first to face rearguard ambushes, the first to roll into liberated cities. Tank crews often fought street to street, engine oil mixing with brick dust and fire. But time and again, the Easy 8's mobility turned battles from stalemates into breakthroughs. In one report from the 14th Armored Division, dated April 17, 1945, a platoon of Easy 8s covered over 60 miles in one day, capturing 5 towns and destroying multiple German vehicles, all without mechanical failure. That kind of endurance was unheard of for the heavy German tanks, which often broke down after just a few miles on poor roads. The Germans had built machines of perfection, but perfection could not outrun the inevitable. The Easy 8 was not elegant. It was not feared for its armor or gun. It EVI was feared for its persistence, the way it kept coming, faster than anyone expected, again and again, until resistance simply broke. April 30th, 1945. The same day, Adolf Hitler took his life in Berlin. On the outskirts of Munich, the last operational Panthers of the 2nd SS Panzer Division took defensive positions. They were waiting for the inevitable. At dawn, the fog lifted to the sound of engines. American columns appeared on the horizon. Shermans, half-tracks, infantry carriers, an unending tide. Among them, Easy-8s led the way, their 76mm guns gleaming through the mist. The engagement was brief, violent, and final. Outnumbered, the Panthers fired their last rounds, then fell silent. Their crews abandoned the machines and fled into the forests. By nightfall, Munich was in Allied hands, the German tank. War. The armored duel that had defined the Second World. War was over. The M4A3E8 didn't win the war alone, but it carried the men who did. It symbolized the moment when design met necessity, when speed became the weapon that armor could not stop. And on the battlefields of 1945, speed was the last word. The tanks rolled to a halt. Crews climbed down, staring at the quiet ruins around them. Europe was silent for the first time in 6 years. The Easy-8s sat idle, steel machines that had outrun a dying empire. 1945, Germany had fallen. The war that had swallowed continents was finally silent. The smoke above Europe was no longer from battle. It was from cities learning to breathe again, and among the ashes stood the machines that had carried men through the storm, Panthers, Tigers, Shermans, steel ghosts, resting where they had stopped. But one stood apart, the M4A3E8 Easy-8. In the first weeks after Germany's surrender, Allied engineers and intelligence officers fanned out across captured territories. Their mission: study the wreckage, record the data, and understand how the world's greatest armored army had been defeated. At testing grounds in France and Belgium, engineers lined up captured German tanks, Tigers, Panthers, even the massive Königstiger. When compared to the Easy-8, the results were clear. The Panthers were deadly on paper. Their guns longer, their armor thicker. But they were fragile, complex, and mechanically overburdened. For every Panther produced, America could build 6 Easy-8s. For every Tiger, 10. And those numbers had told the story long before the guns fell silent. The German doctrine had sought perfection. The American doctrine had sought efficiency. In the end, efficiency won. Speed had replaced strength. Adaptability had replaced precision. And the Easy-8 had become the proof that a simpler, faster weapon could outlast even the most advanced enemy. But victory came at a price written not in steel, but in blood. The U.S. Army lost over 19,000 Shermans during the war. Thousands of them burned-out hulks left across Europe. Inside each, a crew of 5, ordinary young men, often on their first combat tour, fighting against machines built to outclass them. Even the Easy-8, with all its improvements, was no invincible savior. Its armor could still be pierced. Its engine could still catch fire. And yet, what made it different was not what it survived, but how it moved. Crews described the tank as alive, responsive, fast, forgiving. One gunner wrote in his journal, "The E8 doesn't fight you, it runs with you." For many, that feeling of control, of movement, of not being trapped in a steel coffin, changed everything. They had faced the feared German Panzers, and this time they had lived to tell the story. As the U.S. Army reviewed the war's lessons, The Easy-8 stood as the model for what future tanks would become. The balance between mobility, reliability, and firepower became the new blueprint. Within months, its design philosophy was carried forward into the M26 Pershing, then the M46 Patton, and later the M48 and M60 lines that would define Cold War armor. Even Soviet engineers studied the Easy-8's mechanics, comparing them to their own T-34-85s. It became clear that in the closing months of the war, tank warfare had entered a new era, one where movement mattered more than mass. The Easy-8 was not the strongest tank of the war, but it was, perhaps, the smartest evolution of it. Born from desperation, refined by experience, and proven by fire. When the last tank rolled home, its steel still carried the story of every man who had trusted it with his life. The war was over. But the lessons of the Easy-8, of speed, survival, and adaptation, were just beginning to shape the next generation of warfare. The war had ended, but the machines of war did not sleep for long. In 1950, only 5 years after victory in Europe, American tanks once again rumbled into battle, this time across the hills and valleys of Korea. And leading them, still reliable, still fast, was the M4A3E8 Easy-8. When North Korean T-34-85s swept south across the 38th parallel, American tankers found themselves facing a familiar shape, the Soviet descendant of wartime armor. The Easy-8s that had survived Europe were pulled from depots, hastily repainted, and shipped across the Pacific. Against the T-34, the old Sherman proved itself once again. The 70-76 gun, though dated, could still penetrate the thinner armor of its Soviet rival. And more importantly, the M4A3E8's mobility, refined for Europe's mud and snow, now excelled on Korea's rugged mountainsides. At the Battle of Pusan and later at Incheon, the Easy-8 became the workhorse of early U.S. armored operations. It wasn't elegant, but it was there when needed. Dependable in every condition, adaptable to every terrain, crews who fought in both wars described the same feeling. It may not win beauty contests, but it gets us home. For a design born in 1944, still surviving and winning in 1951, that was legacy enough. After Korea, the Easy-8 gradually retired from frontline service, but its legend only grew. In museums, training schools, and foreign armies, it continued to roll for decades. Nations like Israel, Pakistan, and Argentina would operate modified M4A3E8s well into the 1960s and 70s. Each told the same story. It was a tank that could be repaired with a wrench, fueled by almost anything, and trusted by anyone who climbed inside. Historians began to recognize what the numbers alone could not, that the Easy-8's greatest strength was not its weapon or armor, but its design philosophy. It proved that mobility and simplicity were not compromises, but multipliers, and that victory in modern war belonged not to the heaviest tank, but to the one that kept moving. Decades later, veterans from both sides of the war spoke of their encounters with the Easy-8. A German Panzer commander, interviewed in 1963, admitted, "We had the stronger tanks, but they had more of them, and they never stopped coming. Even when we destroyed one, another appeared in its place. Faster, quieter, we began to understand that we were no longer the hunters." American tankers, by contrast, remembered the E-8 with affection, not as a marvel of technology, but as a survivor's tank. They spoke of its warmth in winter, its steady tracks, and its forgiving controls. It was a tank that felt human, imperfect, but loyal. Narrator, calmly, in every war, a machine becomes more than metal. It becomes memory. And for the men who fought inside it, The Easy-8 became the line between death and survival. By the late 20th century, the Easy-8 stood as one of the longest-serving tanks in history. Its silhouette appeared in museums, parades, and films, from Normandy to Korea, from Europe's fields to Asia's hills. It was the last of the Shermans, and the first of the truly modern tanks. Its balanced design influenced nearly every armored vehicle that followed, not in appearance, but in spirit, fast, reliable, economical, and always where it needed to be. Narrator. Where the German tanks became myths of power, the Easy-8 became a symbol of endurance. Not the tank that ruled the battlefield, but the tank that refused to leave it. Music builds, slow brass with subtle snare rhythm, evoking pride and melancholy. And in that, it defined the new face of war, not about domination, but momentum. The M4A3E8 was never meant to be a legend. It was born from necessity, a hurried answer to a desperate war. Yet from that urgency came something remarkable. Machine that understood the rhythm of battle better than any before it. It did not conquer through fear. It conquered through motion. Where others stopped to fight, it moved. Where others hesitated, it advanced. It taught armies that momentum, not mass, wins wars. Long after the war ended, veterans remembered the Easy-8 not for its gun or armor, but for its sound, the rhythmic hum of its engine, the vibration through the floor, the sense that, even when the world was collapsing, it could still go forward. In that sound lived a promise that technology, when shaped by human need and courage, could become more than a weapon. It could become survival itself. The Germans built the perfect tanks. The Americans built the right ones. And in that difference lay the future of modern war. Dictator. Easy-8 did not just end an era. It, Kitty, began a new one. One where victory belonged to those who moved fastest, thought simplest, and adapted quickest. It was not the strongest tank of World War II, but it was the one that kept moving until the world itself changed. The M4A3E8, the Easy-8, the tank that taught the world that speed can be a kind of strength,